Hello, my name is Gibb and I'm from the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence in the University of Glasgow. I'm going to talk to you today about demand groups, and I'm just going to share my screen and show you some slides. So what I want to do today, rather briefly, is just make a few points that build on the fact that we shouldn't work on a policy presumption that there's a kind of unified or homogenous demand for privately rented housing. And that is something that has a number of ramifications, which we'll try and draw out a little. So first question really is, what things drive rental demand? Well, on the one hand, clearly, there are the usual things like income levels, the rents that are paid, relative prices in different places, underlying demographic forces, and the like. But this is an area, the private rented sector is an area where cross-price elasticities, as economists call them, are particularly important. In other words, the demand for rental housing is a function of what's going on in the owner-occupied sector and a function of what's going on in the social rented sector. When they have changes in outcomes, that will be rapidly transmitted to the rental market. What that means is that the rental market often acts as a shock absorber or safety valve. But in addition to that, it's increasingly the case that people don't see renting in the market as a transitionary short-term thing, but something that they might actually do on a longer-term basis. So an important question is the extent to which their demand is effectively constrained. And we know, for instance, that maybe 40% or more of lower income tenants say they would rather be in a different tenure. So to what extent is that demand constrained, and to what extent are other demanders actually indifferent to the tenure they're in, or actually positively see value? Perhaps the trade-off of paying relatively less for a share in a home and multiple occupation in a desirable location relative to the kinds of property one could buy, that becomes a favourable trade-off for a point of time. That's just one reason. So why I find this, I think, is interesting is it already starts to suggest that demand is a little bit more complicated than it might be generally regarded when, particularly economists, I think, take a rather helicopter, top-down, simple view of the rental market. A key characteristic of those simple kind of models is to view demand as homogeneous, as that similar groups have got similar interests, whereas real rental markets appear to be much more heterogeneous, and that they may be more or less segmented. And in fact, I would argue that they're quite well-defined segments which reflect different interests, capacities, time horizons, and needs and wants in relation to their housing. Furthermore, I think that leads to some complex interactions with the regulations in the system, which may not be sufficiently nuanced to just be about one niche, but actually to be about large parts, if not all, of the sector. The tenancy law may also be more or less well suited to different parts of those demand groups, and that wider drivers and shocks like COVID, like economic downturns, like a range of other things such as Brexit and impacts on migration, etc., that those shocks will be differentially felt within the rental market. So all of this will effectively impact demand segments in different ways, differentially, suggesting that we should be at least cautious about one-size-fits-all policy regulatory positions. And I think also, as perhaps we'll see later on in this short presentation, that this may make unintended consequences a little bit more likely. So I'm not going to try and pretend that this is an exhaustive listing, but I just want to pick out half a dozen of the kinds of key demand segments that I'm talking about. So first of all, they're what you might call low or insecure income households, people who have infrequent and inconsistent working and hence income in their household, as well as people who are on lower income. And these people clearly are, in a sense, choosing between the rental market and social rented housing to some extent. And we often talk about probably the longer term preference to help such people into good quality social housing. Secondly, there's what we might call key workers or struggling workers. And by struggling, I mean that these are people who are doing important jobs in our towns and cities or elsewhere, but they are unable to qualify for social housing. They wouldn't be able to afford home ownership, and they may even be finding it hard to pay high-level market rents where they live. Thirdly, there's a kind of cluster of people who are young professionals, perhaps coming into a city or town, people seeking easy access housing because of immediate needs, perhaps because of household dissolution, as well as economic migrants coming from somewhere else who have jobs in the target destination area. And all of these people are part of that increasing group who have been more likely to be private renters in our cities and towns in recent decades. There's also a returning phenomenon, a phenomenon that we've recognized from perhaps the 50s, 60s, and 70s of people who are long-term private tenants. They may have entered the private rent sector at an older age, but they may also be people who simply didn't have access to home ownership, weren't going to be in the social rented sector, so they found themselves as longer-term private renting households. And of course, they will have different requirements as they age. Fifthly, students are an important subsector, of course, of the private rented sector. We'll talk more about them in a minute. And finally, there are a cluster again of perhaps vulnerable and pressure groups who again would probably best be in some form of social rented housing. I'm thinking here of, for instance, people in temporary accommodation and the like. So that's just to really give you a flavour of the kinds of different segments. And as I say, I would contend that the needs and interests of the groups here are not necessarily coterminous. So this is my final slide. I just want to finish off with a couple of examples of the ways in which different segments have evolved, and also how there might be some knock-on or unintended effects that they may experience because of changes to the wider system. Start with students. Students have a number of choices as to where they're going to live. When they're at university or college, they may choose to stay in the parental home, or they may, if they're mature students, they may already have some kind of more permanent home. They may live in their first year in halls of accommodation, the traditional kind of pathway. Thirdly, they may go into the traditional private rented sector, which until recently would have been the dominant form, probably post first year for many students. Sometimes HMO, sometimes a couple or two friends staying together, etc. And more recently, there's been this really rapid acceleration in purpose-built student accommodation, particularly in Glasgow and Edinburgh in Scotland. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So the context is student numbers have risen significantly and are projected to continue to rise significantly. Part of that, though not exclusively, is the international market, particularly postgraduate. And as I say, the key feature of recent times has been the growth of purpose-built student accommodation. And you can divide that into two, really. The group which student numbers are nominated by the universities or colleges, and those which are privately let and are private agreements. Important to recognise that PBSA accommodation is not part of the Scottish private residential tenancy. So it has its different leasing rules, and often students have lets for something like 40 odd weeks, for me 43 weeks, and the rest of the year can be used for holiday lets, etc. And in a sense, PBSA is a form of build to rent. It's got the same kind of characteristics as build to rent, including some of the additional features that upper end versions have. And of course, PBSA has had a remarkable effect on our neighbourhoods, the studentification of our neighbourhoods, but has become part of set of issues around affordability and the quality of accommodation, particularly during COVID, and is actually featuring now in a review that the Scottish Government's doing of student accommodation in the midst of the wider New Deal for tenants. And I think the reason that this is particularly interesting, apart from the impact that this new form of housing is having on our towns and cities and the student accommodation market, is there are now strong indications that in our cities, there is a shortage of student housing in the traditional private rented sector, that landlords are increasingly reluctant to let to students, and in part that's generating the affordability concerns as the market gets squeezed. And this seems to be to do with one of the implications of the 2016 Act, where the new tenancy meant that students would have 28 days, as all new tenants have, to think about maybe choosing somewhere else. And of course, a lot of them have chosen to do that. Their time horizons are, after all, somewhat shorter. The other thing that happens because of COVID, students were not around when the traditional period where they would start tenancies, where they'd be looking for tenancies in the late summer. And as a result, landlords let to other people, other kinds of groups like the easy access young professional groups. And they didn't go after 9 months or a year, they stayed on. So some of the properties were simply taken out of the student market. So that's a bit of a structural concern and an unintended consequence of the Act in 2016, but it has ramifications for universities, for students, for cities, and for the rental market. Turning to mid-market rent. Mid-market rent is what you might call the subsidised intermediate sector. It's typically new build or refurbished homes and is provided by housing associations and or their subsidiaries. It's grant funded from the Scottish Government. The rent is linked to local housing allowance and is below the market rent, as it were. Tenants have qualifying conditions like income caps. And again, this is a form of build to rent. In a sense, it's the kind of subsidised form of build to